All right. Good morning. Welcome. Thank you for taking your time joining us this fine Wednesday on a troubleshooting deployment of Windows 10 session. We happen to be deploying a bunch of Windows 10 machines in this session, but everything that we sort of discuss and demonstrate here today is also applicable to Windows 8.1 and to current Windows 7 deployments because, face it, that's what we all are currently deploying anyway, at least in production. Windows 10 is fun for lab and test, but, well, not ready for production just yet. My name is Johan. This is Michael. I work for Knowledge Factory. Michael works for TrueSec. We used to be working for the same companies, or same company, a few years ago. Now we are bitter competitors, of course. And also in the irony of everything, we do more work together now than we used to do when we were in the same company. So I guess we're not that bitter.
Which depends on the fact that our CEOs doesn't really have any track of what we actually are doing anymore.
Yeah, it's better to ask for forgiveness later.
Yeah, works for me.
Yep, works. So we absolutely love questions. If you have any questions throughout the session, feel free to raise your hand. We'll be happy to answer them. If you have questions after the session, reach out on Twitter, Facebook, social media, whatever you can find. And as the quote says, if you're not on Twitter yet, get on Twitter, period. There is simply no better way these days to quickly get a grasp about what's going on in a specific technology field. And not only follow us, but also check the people that we follow. Because we try to follow the people that we know are really good in what they do in, for example, MDT deployment, config manager, data center things, and, well, the stuff that we work with. It's a very good resource for information these days. So, this is a technical session. You cannot be afraid for Notepad. You shouldn't be afraid for command prompts or scripts. That's the assumption for this session. And, well, it's going to be pretty technical. So, let's start with some basic. This is the top 10 tips. So, we numbered them to make sure we got them all. When starting to do config, how many are using config manager in here? Everybody in the room, awesome. This information happens to be applicable also to some of the light touch deployments, but it's unintentional. It just happens to be, it works the same way. This really is centered around the config manager space, really. So as you probably know, when things go wrong in config manager, you have basically two options. One, crying, which is a perfectly valid and not uncommon solution also, but you have to dive into the log files. And as you probably know by now, the log files are not really meant to be read by Notepad, unless your first name is Wally, and then you use Notepad. But for the rest of the world, you use see and trace. See and trace is also available in Windows PE. Config Manager automatically adds it to the boot image, so it's available when you start it. The challenge, I think, with the current implementation is that they put that utility in a specific folder, which is not in the path of the boot image. So you always have to type the path, or you simply modify the config manager behavior to put it somewhere else, like in the Windows folder and the System32 folder, where it's actually available when you need it in the boot image. The current challenge with the log files is that it's too small. That's being addressed now in upcoming service pack, like next week, and also the future release of Config Manager V Next. But already today, it's quite easy to actually increase the size of it, and I'll show you how to do that, so that's no problem. Okay. In terms of debugging the sequence itself, we have an upcoming demo later on where I will show you how you can actually launch interactive things during a sequence so you can run a script time after time after time to debug it and still be within the full config manager and the sequence environment. Otherwise, it's commonly that you have to deploy a sequence. Okay, it failed, you fix something, go back to the server, you wait, you update, and then you try again. And you spend like 25, 30 minutes every time you try to do a deployment in the best test cases. But the deal with Config Manager, as long as you don't do a media-based deployment, every action in the sequence actually reports status messages back to the server. So if you go into status messages and you can do a query, you can also search for these messages on the site server. If you have integrated with MDT, which you should, you also have some additional server-side logging that you can enable. And that's simply as going into an ini file, set the property on one of the lines, and you automatically have server-side logging. And the way it works, it will automatically capture log files from the client up to the server if something goes wrong in the deployment, and also when the deployment is completed successfully. And the cool thing about this property, it doesn't only copy the SMSTS log file. It actually reaches into the system and looks for a vast array of log files. So it's about 18 or 19 log files it looks for. And depending on when it failed, you will see different log files coming back from the client back to the server. And to give you an example, if the sequence failed when it was trying to do driver injection, there will be log files that can help you debug that. For example, the DISM log file. And you will see that if you enable SL share, that log file will be copied from the client to the server. If it failed when it tried to join the domain, the net setup log file that can help you troubleshoot join domain operations is being copied back to the server. So this option or operation basically reaches out into the client and try to find information on the client to help you debug the system and put them in a location where it's easy for you to reach them. Because how fun is it on a scale to try to convince an end user, not technical savvy, to press F8, get a command prompt, find the log files, do a net use to a server, and copy them to you. That's not fun.
No, what happens is that you ask the user, did you have any issues? Yes, there was a big red error. What did it say? Error. Thank you. Then I can troubleshoot error for the rest of the day.
So the initial part of the setup is obviously get it going in the first place. And most companies, they use Pixie to start most of the production deployments, unless it's a refresh, unless it's a boot media deployment, etc. And what we run into all the time is, if you have an issue with Pixie, it's often very not config manager's fault. It's often the network team's, the configuration of the network, put it that way. So what you need to go about to a local store, you need to buy yourself a nice bottle of whiskey, you need to go into the network team room, and here you go, and then ask nicely for help getting Pixie to work. There are two ways you can configure Pixie. One is right, one is not right, and they're both listed here. Which one is the correct one? IP helpers, every time of the day. Please do not use DHCP, ever. It's like a super last resort. IP helpers is the thing. So convince your network team to configure IP helpers on the various VLANs that you have, and you will find that every machine that you have will happily Pixie boot. If you start to do DHCP, you will find that some hardware work awesome, work great, and some simply doesn't, because the way the Pixie ROM is implemented. It can help by doing a BIOS upgrade sometimes, but often it's simply go back to IP helpers and life is good. Then, of course, there could be things in config manager that is wrong as well. And what I find a lot of people get confused with is they have a few sequences which they deployed, and they all have a different boot image, which is also, of course, available on the DP. So they start the deployment, and the wrong boot image is started. It turns out to be that the one that you deployed last is actually the one that is being used. And if a sequence needs another one, it will try to stage it locally and reboot and then use that one. But what happens if you have a nice laptop capable of 64-bit UEFI, and the last deployed boot image was a 32-bit UEFI one? It won't even boot. So you will never get the real boot image, ever. So now with UEFI-based machines, it's more challenging. What you often end up to, you have to pick one boot image that you use for most of them. The rest, you will have to pre-stage into a collection and target the 32-bit deployment to that one, or use a USB stick media, for example. Other things that could be incorrect is the configuration of the boot image itself. You simply forget to distribute them. You forget to configure them for Pixie, so they're not being available in the remote install folder. There could be, of course, drivers, and Michael will talk about that later. But that part is only when the boot image is actually downloaded.
I'm sorry, Johan, you're missing one thing. Even if you do everything correct, you also need to add coffee into the equation, because you need to sit and wait. At least 5 minutes or maybe 10. Or
That entirely depends. Let me show you a Pixie boot. I will go to a client, go to a clean snapshot, and I will Pixie boot this client and see if it works. One, two, 3, 4, 5, 6. You have to be a pretty fast coffee drinker.
yeah, but I was talking about the part when you create the boot image and you distribute the boot.
Oh yeah, that takes some time, yeah. So this was about 5-6 seconds boot time. Pixie, over the network. How many of you in the room are typically seeing those kind of numbers in your environments? 5-6 seconds. It's quite rare, isn't it? So,
you know the record so far I've been seeing as a customer? 45 minutes, and they've been doing that for a couple of years.
And then we also come to the second part of the story. This is not Config Manager. So what you shouldn't have is 2 Pixie servers running at the same time on the same subnet, because they will fight, and the one that responds the fastest will win. So let me try this one again, so I can actually show you the right thing. What can go wrong in a live demo? Now it's pulling from the config manager DP, and it was about 3 seconds now. So why was it faster than my light touch one before? I cheated, yes, exactly. Jumbo packages. First of all, I'm using UEFI-based machine, a Generation 2 VM. And UEFI in general, not always, is much faster to Pixie boot than everything else. The other thing is that on my site server, that's not my site server. Here is my site server. On the supported distribution point settings, which you manage through the nice user interface regedit, it's actually the supported utility. There is a knowledge base article stating that regedit is the supported utility to edit the advanced configurations of a config manager distribution point, the thing you cannot do in the console. And one of the things that you can add here, as you can see, I've added a RAM disk at TFTP block size. So let me get Zoomit running for the people in the cheap seats of the room. But you can see I've cranked it up to 16K, and that's why it's much faster. And this may work on your hardware, or it may not work on your hardware. It depends on the hardware. Most modern hardware can deal with 16K. If it doesn't, go back to 8. If it doesn't with 8, go back to 4. If you're using VMware, don't never ever configure this. Because VMware doesn't like this. But this is on a per DP configuration. So if you have a data center, we do a lot of deployments, simply don't do it on that DP, but do it for the remaining DPs that are out in your environments, where you may not use VMware to deploy those physical machines. But this at least allows you to deploy it much more quickly. But again, if it doesn't work, try to go a smaller scale, and life is good. So I'll go back to my deployment. I will type in a password. I'll try to type in the right password. And hopefully I should see a list of sequences. Sometimes when you do a deployment, you don't. It simply bails out here. It causes a timeout, and you don't see any sequences. Why? Because you didn't deploy them? Could be networking issues. Could be simply that the machine didn't give an IP address quickly enough, or that simply the network is slow for some reason. And we have seen this sometimes when upgrading from SP1 to R2, where the previous environment worked great, but now after the upgrade, especially when having solid-state drives on the box, we see timeout issues. So how do we fix them, Michael?
The timeout issues in SSD?
No, the policies coming down.
Well, that depends. I have no idea what you're asking for right now.
Okay, never mind. There are two properties that you can set on the boot image itself that will give it more time to look for policies. That's one thing you can do. Another thing you can do is to set sequence properties that will allow the sequence itself, once it's actually found and used, to give more time to find components like applications or packages or software updates. And we'll show you those later. But please just remember that if you start to get policy update issues here, you simply don't get policies. There are configurations that you can do in the boot image that will give it more time, more retries to find those policies. So I will select my Windows 10 deployment sequence, and by the way, Windows 10 is not supported to be deployed by Config Manager 2012 R2 until next week. Because next week we'll get the Service Pack 2 bits, and then it's supported. So I just wanted to say it for the record, and I know that this session is recorded, so now I've said it. All right, so I start my deployment. It validates that all packages exist. This is an UEFI machine, so it will start to do that. And eventually this sequence will abort and come to a pause, which is really useful for debugging. So what I've done to my sequence here, if I open the console, wait patiently, well,
Coffee?
Yeah, coffee is nice. Whiskey is better, but I'm pretty sure it will violate every possible policy that Microsoft Ignite has on their speakers. I think they like them to be sober. I haven't seen it in writing, though, but I assume that's the case.
We need to check that.
So here is my sequence. And here I have added a pause. It's just a script that breaks the sequence at that point. But the beautiful thing is, now when it's broken at that point, for example, in this scenario, I was debugging an issue with partitioning. So I will break the sequence at that point, because now when I go back to my client, I can start to press F8, get a command prompt. I could, for example, launch cmtrace to get a look at the log file, but I can also start to go ahead and run disk part manually. For example, try to list my disk, whatever I need to do, to try to debug it. Because sometimes when you run these utilities manually, something will pop up on you and then help you debug the process. One of the most common things we've seen is that what if the drive is actually encrypted at this point? We've seen Config Manager, and not BitLocker, something else than BitLocker. It will actually break the deployment if you allow it to start. So you need to clean it before it starts the deployment. So how do you do that? How do you start a cleanup process? You can have a pre-start command, absolutely, that you call through the tsconfig.ini file. But what you also can do, and what is little known in Config Manager, if you want to, you can actually put a script in the root, an unattended XML file, if there is one. And if that unattended file calls a script, it will actually run it before doing anything related to Config Manager. So that allows you to clean up or pop up a wizard or something that allows a technician to clean the drive before starting a deployment, avoiding a failure later in the process. A nice thing about the MDT integration as well is that MDT always stages a very special package on the drive, always. And it does that about 5 times in a deployment. But these are the scripts that are available in MDT, and if you have custom scripts that can help you do debugging, I recommend you to add them to that package, because again, it's always available on the local drive. The sequence makes sure of that. So for example, if I go to the scripts folder here, I have a script that I commonly use to enumerate settings in my deployments. So I can simply dump out all the settings I have currently to the screen, or why not simply pipe them to a normal text file. And then I can review that text file. It's not doing very well right now. So these are my current settings in my deployment, and sometimes they can help you debug as well what's going on. So for example, I can see all the variables. I can see that I'm logging to this event service right now, IP address, a lot of information about the machine that is apparently enabled for UEFI. It's apparently a virtual machine, current log path of this. When it will join the machine into the Active Directory later, we'll put the machine into that OU, and so forth. Just a bunch of information, and sometimes information you probably wouldn't like to see here. So what I'm doing here is a very advanced script, by the way. It's 7 lines of code. I'm just enumerating for all the variables that the sequence knows about. So please know that there are, security implications of having the command prompt enabled. It's absolutely awesome for debugging, but please note that someone that actually knows about this may receive information about the deployment they shouldn't possibly have. But anyway, so that was the initial part of debugging. We will continue on that later on, but now it's Michael.
If you flip back to your task sequence, because you missed to show them one thing.
I never miss anything.
No, you just ignored it.
Just because you wanted to show it, it's...
In the top of the list.
Yes, sir.
Yes, so you do have the... no, you didn't... That's the error download, but you didn't add the retries.
I don't have to.
Because you added them in the sequence itself.
Yeah, I hacked them into the template.
Okay, so what we're talking about is the retry account. By default, when you do Configuration Manager 2012 R2, those values could be too low. What happens is that maybe you don't get the list, as Johan told you. But it could also be that about 75% of the deployment is done, and suddenly it says, couldn't read the package. The package is invalid, or a file is incorrect, or I can't read something. And you start to troubleshooting packages and files and HTTPS and all that stuff. Usually that's the problem.
So these are the variables Michael is talking about, and in my case I actually modify them in the template itself, so that every single new sequence I create will have these values. But if you already have a bunch of sequences, which I guess most of you have, and you start to run into these timeout issues, you can just add them as a variable in the beginning of the sequence, and it will do the same work anyway.
And when we are here, you have an SMSTS post-action shutdown, RTO.
That's actually a 0, but yeah.
Why do you have that?
It was actually to fix a bug that was introduced in Windows 8.1, where sometimes when you would log on to a machine the very first time, you would see something like this. Here.
Yeah.
And that command that I add to the sequence that forces another reboot in the end avoids this one.
The problem is that when you're deploying Windows 8.1 or anything, the group policy engine is turned off.
Well, it's suppressed, I think is the correct term.
Suppressed, okay. So group policy doesn't run, which means that when the machine is done, the group policy hasn't been applied to the machine in the correct order. That means it fails when you log on. So what we do is that we end the sequence with a restart.
Yeah. It was a variable that was added back in SB1 for Config Manager, but it's really useful to... I have another one with 5 seconds here, but it's useful if you want to do a final reboot after the sequence is fully completed. The only time this is bad to add is if you also have Config Manager configure to install user-targeted apps, because when you do that, those installations happens when the sequence has completed. And if you at the same time kick in a reboot in the middle of an Office 2013 setup, the Office 2013 setup engine will be unhappy.
Yeah, slightly.
Yeah. Can I go back to your slide now?
Absolutely. You can
I'm
go
just
back.
checking.
Yeah.
It says demo.
Yeah, you've done it.
I know, I'm working on slides
Okay,
here.
so we're talking about drivers. Drivers is still one of the things that we think is challenging. It's the fun part of deployment. New computer, new drivers, and you have no idea if it's going to work this time either. But you can easily calculate on the fact that they won't. So you spend hours and hours and hours to fix that. There are multiple locations where we need to deal with drivers. First of all, we need drivers in Windows PE. They need to be aligned to the version of Windows PE you're running. And the rule of thumb here is very simple. Don't add any driver unless you really, really must. How do you know if you really, really must? Well, that's easy. You fire up the machine on the boot image, and then you press F8, and then you do ipconfig. If you get an IP address, you don't need to add a network driver because it works. Okay, so next check is similar to that. You run disk part, list disk. If you see your hard drive, you don't need storage drivers. End of test, right? Okay, that's it. Don't add drivers just because there are new drivers, because most likely you're going to destroy something. There's a question over here. Yes, sir. So the question is it possible to add the VMware drivers to Windows PE? And the answer is yes, absolutely.
Especially if you have older VM guest configurations that doesn't support, it's supported by WinPE by default. So yes, you can add them.
So that's Windows PE drivers. Then we need other drivers for the setup. Well, that's another driver package. Here are the drivers we need for the machine. And we have basically the same idea of drivers. Add as few as you can. The more you add, the more you need to manage for the next 5 years. You really want to add more job? Don't you have enough to do? So instead of going for it, because I really heard this is a guy that says, well, no, you don't need to come over and help us stage drivers. Okay, so you have all the drivers. Yes, a friend of mine has a hard drive with 15,000 drivers, and we're planning to add them to the WIM file. If we have any problems, can we call you? No.
It says demo here. I'm pretty sure.
I know.
You want the screen as well?
Yes, please.
Let me see if I can manage this nice barcode scaler. Do you think they would mind if we take it with us?
Yeah.
It is nice.
So number one is to create driver packages for Windows PE separated from the Windows version you actually are deploying. And in the Windows PE package, you only add exactly what you need and nothing else. Period, right? You also name the packages like this: Windows 8.1 HP EliteBook 8560 x64. When I do light touch, I don't really need to care about 32 and 64-bit because that's going to be solved in light touch. But when you do configuration manager, to be absolutely sure that nothing really goes bad, you should separate 32 from 64-bit package from drivers. Otherwise, it could be, well, it shouldn't be bad. But the problem is that there's something called OEMs, maybe you've heard of them, and they create INF files. And some of them are good, and some not so good. So sometimes they really specify that this driver is a 32 and a 64-bit driver, even if it's not. Well, Windows can't really know that this is a really bad or badly written INF file, so it's going to try to add them both. So we really separate them. And if I go to my Windows PE drivers here, I have a massive amount of them, like 3. And they are only network drivers and storage drivers. And they should, of course, be in the Windows PE image, which is not really that complicated. So if I go to my boot images, and I open my Windows PE and do properties, they should be in here. How do you actually know they are in there?
Really?
Really, I mean, because here's the problem. You added these drivers, check. You try to boot, it doesn't boot. Okay? And then well, they are in here, and it doesn't boot. Therefore, maybe there's another driver I need. Did you really verify that the drivers are in the image? Yeah, I can see them here. Okay? That doesn't really help us. This is how you actually check it.
PowerShell, of course.
Yes. So what we do is that we create a folder, and then we mount the Windows P image. And you really need to take the right one, the one that has the package number in it.
Yeah, because the other one is a template, and it doesn't really help you.
No, because that doesn't contain any drivers at all. And then we get the drivers, we pump them out, and then we dismount them. So if we run this, script is disabled.
Are you elevated?
Yeah, but I can run it that way instead.
Of course.
So we're going to mount the image.
Wait patiently.
And here we have the drivers. So now I can see, yes, these are the drivers that I really have in here. We can see the class, GUID number, description, if they are boot critical, signed, and so on and so on. So that gives me the, yes, these are the drivers that I'm actually running in that machine, which I need to really know. And then the test is very simple. I mean, we just boot the machine, right? Let's open the machine. Where do we have it? We have it like, I don't know, here maybe? Yeah. Let's apply that. Media. And I'm using Media Boot instead of using Pixie Boot.
It's actually faster to Pixie Boot for you and to find the media.
It's true. It's just that I like to annoy you from time to time, and I'm really good at that.
Yeah. You have acquired a particular skill.
So here's the test. Yes, I do have an IP address.
Yeah, that's the one I showed them 2 minutes ago.
And list disk, yes, we can see the disk. And that's it. We don't need to do anything more than that.
I can add something to that. If you do that Michael did, and the ipconfig returns nothing, meaning you don't have a driver for the network card, don't go to the vendor site, get the driver, inject it, update, wait 10 minutes for it to update the boot image package, and then try again. Get the drivers that you downloaded on a USB stick, plug the USB stick into the device, run driver load or DRV load, and specify the driver.
Yes.
And then run WP init and see if network starts. If it didn't, test the next driver, run WP init and see if that works. Once you find the driver that actually works, that's when you add it to the config manager site server and wait those 10 minutes to get it distributed. So it's all about saving some time there.
A massive amount of time?
Yeah, somewhat of time.
Yeah. So that's the Windows P drivers. For the other drivers, well, that's driver packages, and the same rule applies. No more than drivers than we actually need to have. And then in the task sequence, we need to, of course, make sure that we deploy the drivers correctly. Yes, sir. And here we are. Drivers, package, option, and specify. We call it the
total control.
The total control method. I haven't done anything else than that the last 2 or 3 years. This works, and having the guessing game doesn't really work.
Right. Now, time for another thing that are relevant to troubleshoot deployments, and that makes sure that all the software updates are included. We did have a session yesterday, or I did have a session about software updates exclusively, but I will summarize that session in, well, a minute or two. In Config Manager, as you probably know, you have the option of going to an image, like a Windows 8 image, for example, do schedule updates and inject updates offline into it. While this could be useful for some of the updates, especially if there is a break fix that you need to get going real quick, you don't get all updates this way. And it normally involves a lot of testing, injecting the updates this way. What I recommend instead is not injecting all updates this way, but continue to what you have been using, hopefully, for a long, long time, and that is the server that I paused earlier. And that is simply using LightTouch to create that reference image. It doesn't mean you cannot do this in Config Manager. It just means that often you are way better off doing it in LightTouch for a number of reasons. And the number of reasons are, it's faster, you save some time, you get an image that you can use with everything, not just Config Manager, but also for VMM, for VMware, for VDI solutions, whatever you use an image for. It's easier to develop and test because you can add in breakpoints into the sequence, which will shorten down the development time of that image. You can enable a function for copy profile in Config Manager later on if you build it in LightTouch. And basically, you save some time by spinning up a separate environment. Can be on the same server, of course, but you normally have a separate server for this one because you have updates on that one. And then you simply create your sequences, add the applications to them, and have it sequence install the updates as part of that process. If I want to do the same in Config Manager, which I absolutely can do, you can see that, first of all, make sure you are on CU4, because CU3 and CU4 did include some enhancements to the way the sequence hand over jobs to clients. And that's exactly what happens when you install applications and updates in a sequence. A package is called directly from the site server or the DP itself, but a package, the sequence takes instructions, say to the client, hey, you have job to do, please inform me when you're done, and the client report back and the sequence continues. That's why there have been so many issues with apps in sequences, because timing issues in this communication between the sequence and the actual client. But what I had to do here to get all updates in, I had to add additional updates action into the sequence and to make sure to clean the result in between. And I posted this on my blog as well, Deployment Research, with all the commands I'm using here. But so it is possible, but I think still it's faster and better for you if you do the same thing in the LightTouch operation.
How long time does that build and capture sequence takes?
Currently for Windows 7,
yeah,
about 5 hours,
yeah,
give or take, on a good day. But of course, PowerShell.
PowerShell it is. Okay, so when running PowerShell, there's multiple ways to run PowerShell in task sequences. There are built-in actions, there are custom actions, and you need to start building your PowerShell scripts correctly. Johan and I still use VB scripts for some reasons, and people ask us, why do you still use VB script? Because I have it. But if I'm ever going to write something I don't have, I'm not going to do VB script. That's going to be PowerShell script. So everything that we start on fresh or we want to do a major upgrade on, that's going to be a PowerShell script. One thing that you do in PowerShell script is that you wrap. You use the PowerShell script to run an executable, or you use the PowerShell script to call something else. So the PowerShell script acts as a wrapper of some kind. And one of the things I do on a regular basis is that...
You want the screen?
Yes, please. Is that I run executable codes, exe files. How do you run them in a PowerShell script? Like this. So here's a function called invoke.
Can you increase the font a little bit?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Like that?
Nice.
Invoke executable. There's a command line binding, support should process. That means that if you use like verbose, that function is then transferred into the function as well, which is kind of nice. It takes a couple of parameters, like the executable, the arguments, and it returns, or you can specify what kind of successful return code you should have on that PowerShell script. So it takes all these parameters and then it runs that. Very simple. That means that we can now do things like this. Invoke executable, executable, specify the executable with the arguments and specify the return code. That's an easy way to run. So what happens when it runs is that it starts a new process and grabs whatever information that process then will exit in and return that back to PowerShell, which means that if your application is supposed to return 0 and it returns 0, then it's good. If it returns something else than 0, then it's bad. Therefore, you can easily pick all these things that is supposed to be returned back. The question is, how do you run them in Configuration Manager? Well, here's how you do it. So, in this case, we have a custom task sequence. Could be any task sequence, but this is a custom one. I use the toolkit together with gather. And then, just for the fun of this, we're going to set a task sequence variable. The variable name is stuff, and we're going to specify it as msignite. Then, when I run this PowerShell script, which we are going to look at, you can see it says demo PowerShell script.ps1.
Zoom it.
You mean I need to have zoom it?
Yeah.
Now, every time I don't have zoom it installed,
you will get the whack on the head, yes.
Or my leg hurts.
Nice.
As you can see, the PowerShell script name is demo PowerShell script.ps1. Parameters is dash the stuff info. And I'm going to do %stuff%, which is the variable I set on the previous command line. That's one way to run it. Another way to run it is to use this method instead. It's the same story. It's just instead of using the built-in function, I'm using PowerShell.exe. It's up to you. This way, you can control it better. You can modify how it should run, things like that. The downside is that it doesn't present the information back to the screen. So it depends on what you're looking for. If you need to run a script, then you need to have a verbose information popping up in the script on the screen, then you should use the built-in action. If you don't need that, because the PowerShell script is just supposed to fix something, and it doesn't matter if someone can see it or not, this one is perfectly fine. And the other one is to run this. This is the native configuration manager method. It's just a package where you specify the script in it. In this case, I have a package called PowerShell script. That's easy enough. Just throw every script you have in a bunch of scripts in one package, and then you can deploy it. So let's open up the script and look how it looks like. It looks like this. As you can see, one of the parameters we have is the stuff info, which means that we are going to accept that as a command line. We also have a bunch of functions. In this case, we are trying to find out what kind of operating system we have. And then we have this one. This is kind of funny. What does it do? Well, it tries to load the same object that Johan did in his VB script. If it does succeed to load it, then we know we're running within a task sequence, and therefore we can grab information, like the log path. So this script works as a standalone PowerShell script, and in that case, it's going to log to the temp folder. If I put it in a task sequence, now the script will use the log folder and store the log files in that.
I'm sorry, I can't allow this
to happen. Okay, sorry.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Should I change this too?
Yeah, that would be nice of you.
Okay. And then we just figure out where this script is located. So instead of trying to get all these, is this package going to end up in the C drive or D drive or whatever drive is going to be, I can use split path, parent, my invocation, my command path, which is going to be, this is the location for the folder where I am, and this is the name of the script. I can get other things as well if I want to do that, and then we bump it out to the log file, and then we can use write progress activity, doing the thing, and this is actually going to be pumped out as a part of the script. So let's run this and see what happens. So here's the machine called PC001, and it has something called PowerShell as King application. Let's reinstall that.
You mean the sequence, I hope.
Yeah, with the sequence. Well, it's reinstalling the task sequence, which is running. So you can see it's downloading the toolkit package, and then it's going to run the gather, and then you're going to see the script. And when you see the script running, you're going to see in the sub area of the script all the parameters being pumped out, including the msignite, which is now a task variable, task sequence variable. And this is so funny to watch.
Yep. There is a timeout in the script that is being called right now, the CTI CCM script, 30-second timeout. You can actually remove that as well to speed up the process a little bit. I've done that in my environment, but apparently...
No, I didn't do that. And life is good?
Life is good. Life is good. And the car runs fine?
No, not really.
Haven't got it yet, right?
No, that's true. More coffee?
Coffee, yeah.
Yeah.
There we go.
So now it's running the PowerShell script, and you can see the script directory, the source root, script name. It's a task sequence which is deployed. You can see the culture. So it's easy to integrate and get all the information. Now the question when we do all these things is that should I rely on the information that I have from the task sequence? Yes, absolutely. But the things you can get directly from within PowerShell, I actually grab it from PowerShell instead. So architecture and culture and things like that, it's easier to grab it from that location instead.
So, but we come back to debugging of those scripts as well in a bit. So let me change subject a little bit. And we touched on this before. How can we work with third-party disk encryption? And we have two scenarios. One, we want to deploy a new machine. We don't care about what's on the box already, so a normal bare metal deployment. And the second scenario is we would like to reinstall it. We want to do a refresh of a machine that is already encrypted with something else than BitLocker. And I can tell you in both of those cases, config manager is very, very, very likely to fail. Unless you do the following. First of all, I mentioned what to do for a bare metal machine. And that is simply have an under 10 file in the root of the boot image that will call some kind of script that will allow you to clean the drive before you continue the process. So if you want a sample of this script, you simply copy it from the MDT installation directory, because this is how Light Touch does its start of the deployment, by having an under 10 file calling a script. So you just copy that under 10 template and you modify the last line in it to launch your script instead of the Light Touch VSF script, which is launched by default. So copy the under 10p template and life is good. The second is for the refresh scenario. You have to really treat that as a replace. I've been talking to companies spending months trying to get a car refresh to work with the third-party encryption vendor, to get their special filter drivers installed into the boot image and all that. Just to realize they only got it to work on one of the versions they had. And then they discovered they had 4 or 5 different versions out in the organization. And now the refresh doesn't work. So they just wasted 3 months. And the same goes now with Windows 10 upgrades. Michael's going to talk about that a bit later on, but this is the deal, really. this is how you avoid it. But for refresh, you treat it as a replace. However, in Config Manager, when you do replace scenarios, you have an old machine and you map it to the new machine. You run the backup on the old one, and then you deploy the new one and hopefully restore the backup in the end. But what if it's the same machine? Well, it doesn't have to go through the state migration point in Config Manager. This is UDI. This is the optional wizard that you get when you have the MDT integration. And when you have that integration, you have additional options on where to store that backup. So for example, if it's a remote office with a bunch of machines, you can manually specify USB stick or USB device. Or why not simply specify network share? And as everything in Config Manager, these can be variables as well. So you don't have to prompt for them unless you want to. You can still have the function in there which allow you now to store that data on, well, any type of device. It can even be a NAS device. It could be another client that is available on that network. You simply specify where to store the backup. And then you do the similar thing when you deploy the same machine again. So with the UDI integration, it's very easy to do a refresh of the same machine, but using two sequences, which again is you have one sequence that is a backup-only sequence that you deploy to the machine that will drive the backup and store it somewhere else. And then you have a normal bare metal sequence for everything else, which restores the backup in the end. And this is all included by default. You just need to activate the wizard if you want to have it. And activating the wizard is really difficult. You change this from a yes to a no, and then you get the wizard. You don't have to create a new sequence to use UDI. You simply flip the switch, and it's automatically being used. So that is nice. And that was the demo, and that's the in-place upgrade.
Yeah. We can take it really brief, and then you can flip to
that says demo.
Okay,
I
so
see it
demo.
clearly. Yeah.
So you can flip to my screen.
All right, here we go.
My screen coming up right now. Yay! Okay, so there's a couple of things you need to be aware of. In-place upgrade by itself actually works in Windows 10. We've done it, it works. Problems are, well, challenges, issues, things we need to think about. Let's assume that you do have an application, and it does work really nice in Windows 7. There's a new version of that application that works in Windows 10. Okay. Well, then you need to upgrade that application before you do the upgrade to Windows 10, right? Well, the new version of the application doesn't work in Windows 7, so it can't be installed on that. So then you need to uninstall that application before you do the in-place upgrade so you can install the application later on. And now it becomes... because maybe that doesn't work because you're going to lose configuration, or maybe you're going to lose settings, things like that. So even if it's possible to do in-place upgrade, maybe there's going to be scenarios where a replace or a refresh scenario makes more sense. We usually ask the customer, whatever you have on your machine, is that something you want to keep? No, we're going to upgrade Office. We're going to upgrade every application we have. We're going to upgrade everything else. Well, in that case, doing an in-place upgrade that takes an hour, and then upgrade everything else that takes 2 hours, maybe a refresh that takes an hour and does everything at the same time, makes more sense. So our basic rule of thumb is, if whatever you have is fine, then an in-place upgrade makes sense. But if everything is wrong from the beginning, then it doesn't really make sense. There's going to be a bunch of things you need to do removing applications, removing configurations, and suspending things like, not BitLocker, but third-party disk encryption, things like that. But how do you know everything went really nice and smooth? You need to look in log files. In the Pantry folder, you will have log files.
A bunch of them.
Yes, a lot of log files. Here's the MIG log file. If I open that with Notepad.
Yeah.
You can see everything that has been migrated. And here's my recommendation and the takeaway for this. Before you even start doing this in production, you do it on a couple of test machines and keep the log files and just store them. So if anything goes really bad, you have something to compare with. Otherwise, you're going to be very surprised because just reading these log files doesn't make sense at all if you haven't seen it before.
And for those of you that start to test the in-place upgrades of Windows 10, you will realize that all these are stored, they are left over on the device after the upgrade. They are in hidden folders but are still stored there. If you want to delete them to save some space on the device, don't delete them from Explorer. Use the cleanup wizard in Windows 10 to get rid of those folders.
Which can be command line, so you can clean out automatically, or you can do that using scripts or any method. But these are the only ways to see that an in-place upgrade did succeed, besides the fact that you can log on to the machine. Question, sir?
Yeah, Johan talked earlier about enabling kind of online debugging, the SL share. Doesn't this stuff get copied to that?
Yeah, it will. In the end, it's going to be copied up.
Repeat the question.
Oh, sorry. The SL share dynamic logging, the online thing, we do have the ability to also use SL share, not the dynamic logging. In that case, all these log files will be collected. Yes.
The setup act log file will be. The migration log file will not. But that assumes that you use a sequence to do this in-place upgrade. Yes.
So, looking through these log files to verify that everything worked nice is the only way. But just remember to think of, is really an in-place upgrade going to be valid for this scenario?
Something I would like to highlight before moving on is that there are limitations to the upgrade process itself currently, at least in the current beta or preview. And that is that you cannot use a custom image. You have to use the default one. You can still inject updates offline into it. That's possible, but you can't use your own corporate image.
And that will not likely change either.
No, it doesn't look like that. And currently, there will be third-party disk encryption software and antivirus software that simply cannot be available at the time that the in-place upgrade runs. It will break, so it will abort. So currently, when you start a setup, it downloads an SDB file that holds this information, and it will block, it will stop the setup from happening if it detects a configuration that Microsoft already know is not happening. I was having a chat with one of the managers early this morning about software updates, and he's told me that when Microsoft started to do this internal testing, they will manage to get like 20% of the machines they tried to upgrade successfully upgraded. Now they're up to 80% of all the machines they find that are successfully upgraded. So they've done a pretty good job in terms of figuring out these compatibility issues. But there will be scenarios where you simply cannot do the upgrade. And it also assumes that you have an environment that you are really happy with already, because the in-place upgrade will upgrade it as is. So if you want to start fresh on something, you would probably have to do a normal bare metal deployment as well. All right, so what about debugging scripts then? Well, Michael showed you how to run scripts, but when you try to develop them and you want to save some time in that process, you can actually steal components from MDT to do that. So let me jump over to that environment. I have a client here to which I have deployed a very short sequence. It's quite similar to the one Michael had. And let me show you that sequence on the server. The sequence has currently 3 enabled actions. One that calls the package, one that runs the gather, and one that opens a command prompt in a very special way. It launches the command prompt through this component. That's an executable file that you get with MDT, but it allows you to interact with the sequence. That's how they use the UDI wizard. That's how you can prompt for a wizard where the sequence normally would prevent you from prompting for anything. The normal sequence, while you are in Windows, doesn't allow you to interact with it. But using these components or this component, you can. So let me go over to that client. So Windows 8 client, go to Software Center, and run it. That's not the one, that's the one. So now it's running the sequence, it's running the toolkit package without the 30-second delay, of course, and then it will give a command prompt eventually. And the command prompt is yellow, as it should be. It will be yellow. When it completes. But the deal is I can open up a normal elevated command prompt, which is green. And then I get the yellow one. So now I have two command prompts. One is admin, one is admin. But they are different, apart from the coloring. If I go to the MDT folder, test debugging, and run a script, a VB script, that will enumerate some settings, read some variables, they are blank when I try to do that in a validated normal admin command prompt. When I try to do the same thing in the one that was launched from Service UI component, exact same script, I get the values from it. So now I actually have an interactive command prompt that is system, that is the sequence itself. So now when you write scripts, you can run them, change them, run them, until you nail it. Instead of doing the traditional approach, add them to a package, deploy the package, wait, test it, typo somewhere, fix the script, update the package, wait, and you try again. Now you can just run it until you actually nail it. Also, PowerShell has some really advanced debugging as well. I will just exit this one out to complete the sequence. But if you have Visual Studio installed, one of the nicer additions of Visual Studio, but even the new community version actually works with debugging, you can call it the executable or the script you want to run --x, and it will actually launch the debugger if you have the install in the system. And using a debugger like this will allow you to simply step through script by script, exactly like the PowerShell debugger does, to find information for you. And what often helps when you do that is if you want to debug a script, in this case my CDI generate computer name script, you simply add in some breakpoints to it. In this case, I've added two, let me see, a breakpoint here and a breakpoint here. So it will abort at that point. So now I can go back and continue the script in the debugger. It will go to the first drop. I can check the variables, what they are in the environment without actually having to do anything. So I can follow and watch what happens in the script, and I can do F11 to step through manually, or I can continue to the next stop and continue my debugging. So that can help you reduce the time when troubleshooting scripts as well, which is nice. And that was that. And that was you. No, that's me. That's me.
That is correct.
Yeah. Another thing we run into from time to time is that we have a version of the OS, like Windows XP or Windows 7, and we want to go to something else. And when we go to something else, we also want the machine to have a new policy applied. So we would like to have that machine in a different OU than the original one, but we would like to keep the deployment, the machine name. So what happens if you go into Config Manager and you specify, for example, in the settings package, I have one here, that you would like to have all machines being in this OU. What happens now if the machine is already in another location and you keep the name? Will Config Manager ever move it? No, it won't. But you can easily configure it to move it. And the easiest way, I think, to do that is through the uses of web services. Because when you have the integration, you can easily have them call a web service to move the machine into a different OU. We also have a session tomorrow where we'll use Orchestrator and a few other things to accomplish advanced scenarios, but this is a very simple web service. It's available for download on Codeplex, but it has a move computer OU function. So on my domain controller, I have a machine named PC75. That machine is currently in the workstations OU. I have it right here, but I would like to move it to the Miami OU. So I will go to the Miami OU, I will get the information, distinguished name, copy that, go back to my web service, paste the one in and the computer name, and invoke the web service. It responds true. I go back to my domain controller, and if I refresh this one, we should have PC75 in here. And to call a web service from a sequence, it's very difficult because you need to run a script and you need to have a very advanced configuration here. These 3 lines, that's it. Yes, sir?
Why not just call the move directly from a script instead of stringing the front end?
So why do I want to call it directly from a script instead of having a front end, or?
Why not just call it directly from the script? Like my task sequence, I just have if I'm whatever AD site I'm in.
Exactly.
But during the script, I just call a move.
Absolutely. I do not need a front end to do this. You can absolutely just have a script that calls it from the sequence. The operation is exactly the same. Prompting is only if you want to have the prompting. You can just have the same script running without prompting for anything as well.
Why the front end?
Oh, it was I had the example code in the front end. I was actually using a script as well here to run it. But yes, it's a good point. So either ask for it or simply have a script that runs this and does the move during the configuration.
The important thing is that you use a web service and not have a script that does the move.
That's what I'm trying to say is why not just do the script?
Well, because if you have a script that runs in a task sequence, you're basically making your task sequence a domain admin.
No, he means a script to call the web service.
Yeah.
I'm
No.
not. I do mean directly.
Yeah, that's a security issue. You should never do that.
You're doing that because
This is an offloading, so now you have one account that has the ability to run the web service, and then there's actually another account that actually does the move. So it's an offloading. So it's a security standpoint. Totally.
Oh, yeah. Having a web application on the server side, it's much more secure, and you can have more controls in it than you can have in a script that is client side. You have more options since it's managed code running. All right, now I get the question. All right. That was that. UEFI then. That's fun.
Yes, UEFI is fun. There's a couple of things that we need to address here. Tablets, phones, everything is coming with UEFI. One of the biggest problems we have is that when we start doing tablets is that they're not really meant for being deployed as computers. They don't have network like any other device. So that's one problem. The other problem is that we do have companies today that says, well, we bought a bunch of machines, yes, and they did have UEFI configured in the BIOS, But we turned it off and shifted into to BIOS emulation mode to be able to deploy Windows 7. We have 15,000 machines. How do you easily shift them into UEFI? You hire someone that is really cheap and fast. There is no way to fix it. So what we number one specify for customers is that whatever you have on the machine that you have, you have. Don't spend time on changing it. It doesn't make sense. Instead, next time you do a hardware refresh, then you change it, right? The problem we have with deploying is media. It works using media on every tablet, except the fact that some of these tablets are really interesting. It has one connector, and that's both power and USB, and you can pick and choose. And you don't want to do that. So it's problematic, which means that people do buy docking stations, and then they start putting the whatever device they have in the docking station, and then to deploy the machine using the docking station. Well, that is challenging too, because now the docking station's MAC address becomes an inventory in Configuration Manager. So when you try to redeploy a machine on that machine, you can't do that because that MAC address is already inventoried. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, so what you need to do is that you need to run a full refresh of the machine so it doesn't hardware inventory, so it inventories everything else. Then you can actually reuse that device. It's just that you need to finish your task sequence with a full rescan of the inventory of hardware to get the other MAC addresses, identities inventoried in the Configuration Manager so you can reuse that. We don't allow cross-OS boot, which means that we do need to have 32 and 64-bit, which means that you should really start considering to block the Department of buying stuff from buying things that you are able to support. So if they buy other things, maybe you can support it as a bring your own device, but you can't support it as a deployment machine, because then you need to recreate or redesign half your infrastructure. Also, all these UEFI Class 3 devices which we have only have exactly Class 3, means no compatibility backwards. They need to run Windows 8.1 or Windows 10, and there is no other options. So whatever people say, if you hear this, oh, it's so easy to deploy them, they are lying. You really need to have a factory. It's like, these are all the dongles, the docking stations I have on my desk, and if you need to redeploy your tablet, you need to bring the tablet to me, and then I can re-image that machine, because this is my image studio when I redeploy the machines. Doing it on the fly out there doesn't really work that well. I wish it was, but it doesn't.
There are scripts that can help you, for example, map dongles to be used by different machines available on the Deployment Guide's webpage, because otherwise you will have to basically tie a specific dongle to every device, and sometimes you have to be able to use the same one for maybe 10 or 15 deployments. But by that, we have reached the end of this talk. We'll be around for questions, and we'll be down for a book signing at the Ignite bookstore in about 30 minutes, so 12:30 down at the bookstore, if you have additional questions or whatever thing. But other than that, thank you guys and have a great conference.
Thank you.